in the home stretch, you know, when you're studying the book of Genesis and when you get to Joseph, you know you're in the home stretch because he is really the last. His story is the last story in the book of Genesis. And so let's pick up, let's just go to chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. We've kind of done the background, if you will, to the story of Joseph. We've seen not only his birth and his brother's birth, but the animosity between he and his brothers that led to him being sold into slavery, and that leads into the rest of the story. And what we're seeing here is really two stories at once that are running concurrently, and that is the stuff that happens to Joseph, much of it unfortunate, but then we're also seeing the providence of God using those events. I would argue that God is not directly involved in those events in the sense that God did not cause Jacob to choose a favorite son. God did not cause his brothers to hate him and conspire to either kill him or sell him into slavery. God is not going to be the cause of Joseph being thrown into prison. But God can use those things to bring about his purposes. And the purpose that we're seeing here is that God wants these people out of Canaan and into Egypt. Um, and I would argue the reason for that is we'll see, and I think unless there's objections, we'll just continue the story and move into the book of Exodus next. And we'll talk about that more there, that God sees Egypt, if I can talk here, God sees Egypt as kind of an incubator. That here's this really relatively small family that's going to go into the incubator and they're going to grow and they're going to expand, and they can do so isolated. They would not have done that in Canaan. We see before, we've already seen with some members intermarrying with the Canaanites. When they come back into that land, unfortunately, they're going to do that same thing. But when they go to Egypt, the Egyptians aren't going to like them and they will tolerate them, but they basically will lock them in the attic. So you can live here, but we're going to lock you in the attic. And that kind of sounds like a bad thing, but it ends up being a good thing for God's purposes because the Egyptians and the Israelites won't intermingle and intermarry. And so for God's purposes, and that's why I call Egypt kind of the incubator. They go there about 75 and come out in the millions through their population as just being the children of Israel without the outside influences. That's not to say they're going to be perfect, but anyway, that's God's purposes. All right, so we've seen in chapter 39, Joseph is taken down to Egypt. And remember, the Ishmaelites, Midianites, Medanites were the group that bought Joseph as the slave from his brothers. They take him to Egypt and they sell him, and they just sell him to a man by the name of Potiphar in chapter 39, verse 1. Potiphar is, and let's look at his titles, he's an officer of Pharaoh. And remember, Pharaoh is not a person's name, that's a title, kind of like Caesar, kind of like king, president. And so they say he's an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard. In your mind, at least, underline that title. He's a captain of the guard, and you'll see why in a little bit. He's an Egyptian, and he bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Joseph, the story of Joseph is the story, it's a roller coaster ride. Joseph, and he's down at the bottom of the roller coaster now. He's been sold, taken away from his family, sold into slavery, mistreated by his brother, and now he's going to be a slave. And so he's at the bottom of the roller coaster, but we're going to see him, as best he can, as a slave, ascend in that position. And so very quickly it says the Lord, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was at the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now, we pause there. I don't take that in verse 3 where Potiphar saw that the Lord blessed him. I don't take that as a statement of faith on Potiphar's part. He just probably thought his God, his God is treating him good. So it kind of almost reads like a statement of faith, doesn't it, of Potiphar? But I don't think that's the case at all, Larry. Yeah. Yeah, just sees that again, his God, his Lord is prospering him, not necessarily that, oh, now I believe that God is blessing you, our God is blessing you. The other thing that I want us to see there in verses 2 and 3 is that this seems to be a continuation to the promise that was made to Abraham, that I'll bless you and I'll bless those who bless you. And so we've seen this in the story of Jacob and Laban that Larry just referenced, that not only are these patriarchs going to be blessed, but that blessing is going to rub off on the people that they have contact with. And so we see that promise was made to Abraham, was repeated kind of to Isaac, certainly to Jacob, and we see it not necessarily being repeated to Joseph, but fulfilled in Joseph. That I'll bless you, God says, and I'll bless those who bless you. And so we see that everything that Joseph does is going to be blessed. And so Joseph found favor in his sight, and he makes him the boss of the house, the overseer of the house, and he put everything in his hand. And so again, notice verse 5. So it was from the time that he made him, that Potiphar made Joseph overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. So again, I see that as just a continuation of what God said to Abraham. I'll bless you and I'll bless those who bless you. And so I think we can read from that Potiphar, uh, in ascending him to this position, Potiphar was blessing Joseph, and now he's going to receive that back. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And so he leaves everything in Joseph's hand. Not just puts him in charge, but basically this says, I trust you. Here's the checkbook, basically. I trust you implicitly. But we know how this story is unfortunately going to end for Joseph. Max? Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would certainly think that's a reasonable argument that just shows you how good Joseph was, that he jumped above the locals in that regard. So yeah, all of that just speaks to, I think, to his character too, and not just his character, which I don't want to dismiss that at all. Joseph comes out of this as just an admirable person, but it's also God's blessings in that. And those are connected certainly, but yeah. The last part of verse 6 says, and this is a lead in to the story that follows, Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. That's virtually the same language that was used about a woman earlier in the book of Genesis that just so happened to be Joseph's mother, Rachel. Remember, that's why Jacob just fell for her, is because she was, this says handsome, it's the same word, handsome in form. She was just that beautiful. So he apparently takes after his mother. And so, again, that's kind of the lead in. Potiphar's wife sees him, cast longing eyes, the New King James says, on him, and says, lie with me. But he refused and said, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. And so we're looking at the historical record here, but I think it's wise to make some applications and some lessons from this. And Joseph is a perfect one to look to. That here he is. If anybody had an excuse to do bad, Joseph could have found that, couldn't he? Not justifiably so, but he's been mistreated. He's away from home. Dad's never going to know what I'm doing and find out about this. Surely, I don't know how much Joseph knows what's going on, but he's out of sight. He's been missing. So a lot of times, we use that for excuses to sin. Nobody will find out, nobody will see, and sometimes we just use, look, I deserve this. A lot of times, I think shoplifters and people that steal from work and things kind of feel that way. Well, they're not paying me enough, and so I can take some tools home with me, and that makes it okay. Or I've been mistreated by society, and so I get to steal from Walmart, and so we use those or not we, but people use those justifications. And Joseph, if anybody could have, Joseph could have said, "Look, I'm getting a raw deal," and maybe, just maybe, I know we're seeing that he's moving up the ladder here, but if Joseph was a worldly minded person, who would he have attributed him moving up the ladder to? It's me. And God's forsaken me. God, where was God when I was in that pit? Where was God when my brothers were selling me? Where was God when I was and use all of that? Well, if God's not going to bless me, then I'm not going to serve him. And so, but Joseph doesn't use any of those flimsy worldly excuses that are so often used. That he stands and rises above that on almost every stage. Max?
It's not like he was on the other side of the county. Well, nobody's going to tell anybody about it and all. He 500 or 1,000 miles away from home and probably had no idea that he'd ever get back to home.
Oh yeah, in that culture, in that society, their travel was not like ours. That the belief had to be that I will never see them, and we see some of that at the end of the story, the shock of actually being reunited. Well, we know the story. She presses him. He says no. Finally, she grabs a hold of him in his garment, and he runs away. He hasn't heard the New Testament passage, but he's practicing flee fornication. And he literally does that. He runs away. She has the garment in hand. And as the proverb writer would say, she's this scorned woman now. And so she's going to get back at him for turning her down, and actually completely 180 degrees changes the story. He pushed himself on me, and here's the proof. Well, the coat was really proof that she was aggressively following him, but she said it was proof that he has tried to lay with me. And so it was, verse 19, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but I will mention it to you. Some scholars notice that something's missing in that statement. His anger was aroused. What's missing is, who was it aroused toward? I think we can just assume Joseph, but some make the argument that he wasn't angry at Joseph, but he kind of had to take his wife's side and punish Joseph rather than his. I don't know. Maybe that's reading too much into the story, but he does take Joseph and put him into the prison, and that's the next argument. You'd say, well, wait a minute. If he thought Joseph was innocent, why didn't he throw him in prison? Well, the scholars would argue that that was probably the best case scenario. What would you expect a ruler of this position to do with someone who just tried to sexually assault their wife? Yeah, Joseph would have been killed. And throwing him into prison was, it doesn't sound like that to us, but a kind of slap on the wrist. in comparison. But again, I'm not necessarily making that argument, but I wanted to point that out to you, that argument is made. Yeah, Mark.
Throwing him in prison may have been the cause of him being the man that he is and how high in stature he was, because he was lying. He was taking care of everything he had. He was doing good, and they were you know building his
Mhm.
kingdom was looking getting better and better, and so he finally maybe decided, I can't kill him after he's done all this for me already.
Yeah, it may have been a little bit of that. Yeah, of just yeah. You did wrong, but you've helped me out. So yeah, it could be a little bit of that. So yeah. So Joseph's master took him, verse 20, and put him into the prison. Um, and remember that the prison, we'll talk about that more, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. Seemed to be, as we're going to see, there's some other king's prisoners. Seems to be maybe a different kind of prison, a prison just for the king's prisoners instead of somebody who just robbed, Joe Blow over here. And he was there in prison. But, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And so, just repeating the circumstance. As a slave in Potiphar's house, God is with him. Potiphar notices that, raises him to a position. Now he's in prison, so there's that roller coaster. He's a slave, but he's kind of the top slave. And so I think we could argue that he's on the top of the roller coaster, but now he's in prison, but God's going to bless him even in those circumstances. So we have some positions here to keep track of. We have the keeper of the prison. We'd probably call that maybe the warden, the chief guard, prison guard, something. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hands all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Same circumstance in Potiphar's house. And the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was in Joseph's hand, almost virtual language of what Potiphar did, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Again, just a repetition of the promise made to Abraham, I'm going to bless you. And so the story is going to continue. So now Joseph's back down at the bottom, but he's kind of coming up because of the position that is here. And now Joseph's not the only one in the king's prison. The New King James says the butler and the baker in that. The only thing we're missing is the candlestick maker, if y'all remember that old nursery rhyme. But the butler would have been the one in charge of the food. The baker has been in charge of the food. The butler was in charge of the drink and things that would come to the king's hand. And so notice verse 3 of chapter 40. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Where did we see that title before, the captain of the guard? Yeah, that's Potiphar's title. Now, what we don't know is that referring to Potiphar? There may have been one. I don't know the inner workings of ancient Egyptian office holders. So there may have been more than one captain of the guard. This may have been a successor to Potiphar. Maybe Potiphar's term was up and another or maybe it was Potiphar. It seems a little odd to me that if it was Potiphar, it just didn't say Potiphar. But that's no proof. We would just say the president, and we'd still be talking about the guy who has a name, who's the president. And so the fact that using the title doesn't necessarily mean that it's not him, but it also doesn't necessarily mean it was him. But anyway, he is in the custody of the prison of the guard. I would assume that this is Potiphar. And again, the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. So if it is Potiphar, he's still involved with Joseph's dealings. He put him in charge of this butler and baker. That's a possibility. The butler and the baker have a dream. And so remember, Joseph's story kind of begins with the dream, doesn't it? His own dream, that his brothers and even his father would bow down to him, father and mother would bow down to him. And now dreams come again in the story, not his dream, but the dreams of the butler and the baker. And they were troubled by that. And they sought for an interpretation of that. We're going to see that a lot in Scripture, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know what to make of it. It's big in the story of Joseph. It's big in the story of Daniel. Many, many years later, the idea of dreams and the interpretation and the attempt in these both stories, the failed attempt to interpret those dreams and the successful interpretation of those dreams. We have dreams today. Does that mean that our dreams need to be interpreted? I hope not. I have some weird dreams, and I'd hate to know what they mean in that. But anyway, they come to Joseph. And they just appear before Joseph and they're sad. And so Joseph just said, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" And so they say, "We had this dream." And so he says, "Well, tell me these dreams." And he says, "God will interpret them. Interpretations belong to God. And so tell me these dreams, and I will with God." And so there's maybe the first direct indication. We've read at least twice now that in Joseph's bad circumstances that God's with him and God's blessing him. And we speculated that did Joseph know that, or a selfish person would that's me. I'm rising up because of this. But here's the first indication that no, Joseph knows God's with him because he says God's the one who can interpret dreams, and so tell me your dreams. And so I think we can connect the dots pretty easily there. God's with me, and God will interpret these dreams from me. And so the butler starts, and he says, "In my dream, there was a vine, and the vine had 3 branches, and its blossom shot forth, and it brought forth grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them and made the drink and put it in Pharaoh's hand." That was the dream. And so Joseph says, "Well, here's the interpretation. 3 branches means 3 days. And what this means is that in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to let you out of prison and you'll be back to your position of a cupbearer or the butler to the king." And so, good news. And so he hears that. And so here's the baker over here. Remember, the baker had a dream. And he's like, "Oh, great. All right. Now interpret my dream." And the moral of this story is be careful what you ask for. And so he says, "Interpret my dream." And he says, "My dream, here's what I saw." Um, well, before we get to that, I'm getting ahead of myself. Look at verse 14, crucial part. And so he says, "You're going to be ascended. You're going to go back to your position." Verse 14, "But remember me. Remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house, because I was stolen out of my land. And also, I've done nothing here. And so I'm innocent. When you get back, remember me. I showed you some kindness, and so you remember me." So, all right. So now the chief baker, he's anxious. Okay, good. These dreams are good news. Surely I'm getting out of prison. And he says, "In my dream, I had 3 baskets on my head, and in the top basket there was all kind of baked goods there, and the birds that came and they ate them up." And so Joseph says, "Well, here's your interpretation. 3 baskets mean 3 days." And you can just see the baker going, "Yeah, yeah," with a smile on a grin on his face. "Yeah." That's kind of how the last guy started. "But in 3 days," and I love the language in the New King James at least, "Pharaoh will lift off your head from you." I don't know if that was a common expression among the Hebrews, but he'll lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh. And so 2 very different dreams. And Joseph doesn't say, "Remember me," to this one. And so it came to pass, both of the dreams, the good one and the bad one, come true. And of course, poor Joseph, it starts with his brothers and then with Potiphar's wife. And now the butler, it says the chapter ends, "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Kind of a common, sadly a common story. Now, I don't know if there's a connection, but when I read that verse, There's another verse in the future that comes to mind in Exodus chapter 1 when we talk about the Israelites who are going to end up in Egypt, where Joseph is now. It says of the Pharaoh that there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And so similar, not identical language, but similar language, that here was this butler that went back to his position, and he did not know Joseph. He did not remember Joseph. And then later there's going to be a Pharaoh who did not remember. Again, not the exact words, but did not remember or did not know Joseph. So, all right, so now chapter 41 begins. 2 years have passed. If this was a movie, there'd be that black screen that said 2 years later, ... And so now 2 years transpire, and the Pharaoh has a dream. And we'll talk about what the dream was here in a little bit. Said he has this dream. Again, he's troubled by this dream. He seeks interpretation of this dream. And those in Pharaoh's court who normally would have interpreted these dreams one way or other, most likely is making up an interpretation, probably making up an interpretation that put Pharaoh in a good light. If you wanted to keep your job and keep your head, is probably what you did. The wise men were unable to interpret that dream. And so, ding, something goes off in the butler's head. Dreams, interpretations. What was there? Something there. Oh, 2 years ago. Oh, no, I forgot. And so he goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, I said, first of all, I got to apologize. I was supposed to remember something 2 years ago, but I know a man who can interpret dreams. And so he points him to Joseph. And so they bring Joseph out. Joseph changes his clothes. Oh, by the way, I missed the point. Speaking of changing clothes, remember when Potiphar's wife ripped the jacket off of him? This is the second time he's lost a coat. And both of them were followed by deception, weren't they? His brothers took his coat off of him, lied to their father, and said the beast ate him. And now Potiphar's wife rips his coat off and lies about him and says he attacked me. So, all right, so he changes clothes, shaves, looks good, comes before Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh says, I had this dream, it's troubling me. My magicians and my wise men can't interpret it. And so Joseph says again, it is not in me, but God will give the answer to this. And so he tells Joseph the dream. And I have to tell you, for selfish reasons, this is one of my favorite chapters in all of Scripture. I just love this chapter, and you're going to find out why. So let's back up to verse 3 and look at the first time of him receiving this. He says, Behold, 7 cows came up out of the river. Most likely this was the Nile. It says in verse 2, 7 cows coming out, and they were fine looking and fat. And so you can maybe interpret for yourself why I like this chapter here. They were good looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. But look, verse 3 here, to solidify it, 7 other cows come out of the river, and they were ugly and thin. And so there's biblical argument there for you. Mine says gaunt, but some translations say 7 and thin. They stood by the other cows, and the ugly, thin cows, remember there were 7 of each, they eat the fat, good-looking cows. And then he has another dream, basically just like it, that they were 7 heads of grain that were plump and good-looking. And then 7 thin, spindly, we call them spindly grain, heads of grain. And the thin heads devoured the plump heads. And so Pharaoh's just disturbed. What can that mean? Maybe he probably saw what Joseph's going to point out is basically the same dream there, one about crops, one about cattle. And so what does that mean? And Joseph gives the interpretation to that, and he says that the 5 fat, good-looking cows, 5, where did that come from? 7 fat, good-looking cows, and the 7 plump heads of grain tell us that in Egypt, we're going to have 7 years of plenty. The cows are going to look great. The grain, the crops are going to go great. We're going to have an abundance. You're just going to be amazed at how good things are. That's the first 7 years. But the 7 thin, ugly cows and the 7 spindly heads of grain that come after them tell us that there's going to be 7 years of famine, and that 7 years of famine is going to devour all of the plenty that we have. And so there's the interpretation of the dream. And Joseph doesn't stop with the interpretation of the dream. Notice, let's pick up in verse 32. This is chapter 41, verse 32. The dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice. In other words, 2 different dreams, but basically the same dream and absolutely the same meaning, because the thing is established by God, and God would shortly bring it to pass. Now, I want to get your take on verse 33. Do you read it kind of the way I do? Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. You think Joseph was doing a little bit of this when he said that? You know, he'd already said it about 2 years earlier to the butler, remember me, so that I can get out of this. And so maybe now he sees this as my ticket out. You need to pick a discerning and wise man, probably a guy who's good at interpreting dreams. Who I'd recommend. Now, again, I don't know if that's in there, but I see a little bit of a hint in there. And set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, verse 34 says, and let him appoint officers to the land. And so not just this chief who's over this, but this is going to be such a massive undertaking that we need a bureaucracy involved here. And I don't mean that in a negative way that we sometimes look at bureaucracy, but we're going to need several people involved in this to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And so not only does Joseph, has he demonstrated his wisdom in interpreting the dreams, but now he's employing some wisdom. You know, you need to appoint a wise man over this, and it just so happens I just thought of a wise plan in how we can do this, and it is a wise plan. We'll talk about the elements that make this just a brilliant plan, really. No, go ahead.
Of God here, or Joseph just thinking on his feet here? What's the plan? Because I don't see how the 7 fat cows and 7 heads of grain got 20% coming off the next 5 years and all that. Where did that come up with?
We take Joseph at his word that the interpretation of the dreams was directly from God, but where does that end and where does Joseph? My answer to that is I don't know. I guess I would assume maybe this was Joseph's idea, but it's not out of the question that God was still inspiring Joseph with this plan. I don't know. It's a brilliant plan, I think. And so either Joseph is truly a brilliant man, or this is God easily giving this plan. Max?
Great plan, but it's political suicide if anything went wrong. You know, for Pharaoh to say, okay, everybody, just because this foreigner says we're going to start this, you know, if something went wrong along the line, why, wait a minute.
If that famine never came. So yeah, he is putting a lot of eggs in Joseph's basket. It is. So all right, so let's talk about the brilliance of the plan. Anybody who's good at math, where did we come up with 1/5? It seems like an odd fraction. I mean, it's literally an odd fraction, but where do we think? Convert it. It's easier if you convert it to a percentage. So what is 1/5 as a percentage? You know, it's math class tonight, did you? Okay, that's 20%. So that should help us. 20% is, can we relate that to some other figure in Scripture? Yeah, it's a double tithe. And so the 10%, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the assumption is that was basically their tax rate was maybe I don't know, 10%. And so we're doubling that. That's wise because we're going to have 7 good years, but 7 bad years. And so we need double. We need to double that taxation, double that tithe. And so that we have not just, the 10% is going to be what we just need during the good years, but we're going to need an extra 10% And it's kind of like the story of the manna that they were to gather up on the Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath day, a double portion so that they could have. And so we're making a double portion so that that would amortize out into a 10% over that. I think it's also a wise plan because when is this double tithe going to be collected? It's going to be collected when everything is good, when things are plentiful. And so it's going to be a burden. And doubling taxes is always a burden, but it's doubling taxes on you when you're making a lot of money, when things are coming in good. And so it's not going to feel as oppressive as it would be because, we assume the farmers are making twice as much money now. And so they maybe grumble, but they were not going to revolt. Yeah, yeah, won't feel it as much in that. Um, and so they're storehousing these. And again, it's, maybe I've even kind of used the idea of money, but it's probably been this idea of storehousing these grain and storehousing the goods that was being done here. And I think it's also doubly wise because I'm assuming things worked then agriculturally like they do now. What's the curse of the farmer when crops are good and plentiful? Yeah, well, that farmer's getting rich. Well, no, prices have gone down, and so the giving up that again not doesn't hurt as much because I've got twice as many and it's worth half as much. And so I think there's just all kind of levels of wisdom, and it's not just wisdom, it's necessity. We've got to do this because we've got to store this up because we're going to have 7 years of famine. And so we've got to have these storehouses full of this grain and different things. And the only way we can do that is by collecting it to them. And so put it in reserve. Verse 36 says, for the land, for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. And so Joseph, with this interpretation, this is the surest insurance policy ever sold. Because I think we all feel this way. If you knew good was going to happen, you wouldn't buy the insurance, would you? And if you knew bad was going to happen, you'd definitely buy the insurance, right? Well, he knows bad's going to happen. And so this is basically just an insurance policy. Then you know something bad's going to happen. It's buying car insurance as the train is bearing down on your car. You get on the phone real quick with State Farm and say, I need car insurance. Hurry, because the train's coming. And so it's the surest form of insurance because he knows that bad is going to happen. And so we're putting this aside, even taxing the people to put this aside because of this famine. But again, let's not miss the bigger picture that all of this is God's wisdom, and maybe this would help answer Adam's question, and maybe this is God giving Joseph this because this whole thing is going to lead to Joseph's family migrating to Egypt and being reunited with him. That's the big picture that's we don't know it yet as we're reading the story, but spoiler alert, that's what this is all about, is to get his family there into the land of Egypt. So, all right, we'll pick up there next time.